Hello and welcome to Race to 2020, the new podcast from Sky News Australia. I'm James Morrow, opinion editor of the Daily Telegraph in Sydney and co-host of Outsiders. I'm joined here by Sky News' Jack Houghton, and here we are again for another great, fun week of looking at everything in the American political scene, which has been a little different this week because it's been the Labor Day weekend this weekend, so that has put a bit of a break on a lot of the policy news, but it's also put a lot of people out there campaigning and stuff, going to events, going to barbecues, going to all sorts of things as they try to capture the public's heart, especially on the Democrat side, in their attempt to be the one who will take on Donald Trump next year in the general election. Jack, how are we this morning, mate?
Oh, we're going good. We're going good. But look, I think with the Democratic primaries, the thing that I find really interesting, well, we're still like 8-9 months. It's not going to be decided till July.
Right. Correct.
So how are the front runners preparing for this marathon event?
Well, that's the interesting thing because, you say the word marathon, and that's absolutely correct. We are talking about something that is very much a marathon and not a sprint. We have already seen, we're going to talk about some of the candidates, again, who have gone on big ups and then big fall downs because they keep getting built up by the media. It's almost like watching a lava lamp, which is very sort of, I think, kind of almost appropriate because it's this sort of left-wing, hippie, boomer sort of icon, and now we've got all these sort of, left-wing boomers like, all out there trying to be the next president, and they're just moving up and down in this sort of bubble of the media and the political thing. And I'm not sure, exactly how tuned in a lot of people are into this just yet, but right now the media is working very hard to kind of create a narrative around it. And this is, I think, brings us to the first big question here, which is something that we've talked about a lot on this podcast, Jack, and that is our friend Joe Biden, or as Donald Trump likes to call him, Sleepy Joe.
Yeah, so this Joe Biden is a really interesting phenomenon, how this is playing out in the media, because the way that I'm looking at it, he was a darling at the beginning, right? And now the focus seems to be shifting. Well, they've got a couple of clear favourites, right? Yeah. He's copping a lot of flack, and I notice there's been some New York Times articles criticising him, saying, "Why do you want to run?" And instead of actually answering it with, "Well, I want to do this. I want to change, inequality," or the traditional Democratic answer, it's simply to get rid of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He's playing...
And in fact, actually, there was that great moment in, I think it was the first Democrat debate, where he was so focused on this idea of beating Donald Trump that he was asked, the question went out to all the candidates, what would you do on your first day in office if you were to win the presidency? And he just sort of robotically said, "Keep fighting Donald Trump." And it was like, "Hold on, dude, you've won. This is the future, okay?
Me.
Just put yourself in those shoes." And that also was, I think, one of the first moments that people started to say, "I'm glad you've got your Make America Great Again."
Don't mind me. I'm just drinking from the appropriate.
Got your MAGA cup there. I hope we don't trigger any Hollywood liberals who are out there listening or watching. We'll be talking about some of that a bit later. But so that was the first, I think, of these sort of things where people said, "Hang on, that was a bit weird. What the hell is he talking about?" And then, we've had this whole cavalcade of just really strange things he said, where he's just kind of missed it, and we speak about them almost every week. It
displays, are his cognitive faculties there?
Well, that's the concern.
Is he actually getting tired?
Well, that is good. Is he tired? Is the Sleepy Joe moniker really, actually more devastatingly accurate than we know? Because often these Trump sort of superquits always wind up being...
It's very funny because I thought it missed the mark when I first... Because he's normally pretty spot on, and then Sleepy Joe, I was like, has this missed the mark? And as the weeks go on and as this turns into a marathon...
No, he had the measure of the man. And the thing is that, like,
nailed it.
Trump, I mean, just to go back to the last election, one of the reasons why Trump won is that he simply had huge stamina. He was doing 2, 3, 4 events a day in these key states and just getting out in front of so many people. So he knows what it takes to be president. That involves, a lot of retail politicking. And, Biden, his campaign is right now seems to be on the go slow. He'll do an event.
How's he looking polls-wise?
Well, so his polls, as I say, polls are still up there-ish, but soft. There's clearly a lot of appetite to start moving somewhere else. And what's really interesting is that you're now starting to see the Washington Post and the New York Times running articles that are critical of Biden. And to me, what this is saying is that in those newsrooms, those editorial suites, they are thinking quite clearly, because they have absolutely no pretense anymore at the Times or the Washington Post of being unbiased. They're not playing it straight. They have said,
surely you jest.
They have said quite clearly, Jack, that their goal here is to prevent Trump from winning re-election. So that's what the whole thing where they had that extraordinary New York Times meeting we spoke about that got leaked, where they said, well, we need to refocus from Russia to race because the Russia thing didn't pan out for us in our attempt to get Trump, so now we've got to turn it into a whole big racial thing. Who cares if we tear the country apart in the process? The point is we've got to get Trump. So we've seen the Washington Post running articles now critical of Biden. And what's interesting now is that there's been a Reuters piece now, and Reuters gets picked up elsewhere, and there's an interesting piece here. They've written, and it's a bit of a sort of almost like a dispatch to everybody. Biden, 76, has consistently maintained a comfortable lead over his rivals, but his campaign has been plagued by doubts over his age, fitness for office, and whether, as a moderate, he can be a standard bearer for a party that has grown increasingly liberal. And then it goes on to say, those questions are likely to be magnified in the coming weeks. That's almost like, the assignment desk there saying, all right, go get him, boys. We've got to, take down Biden. We need to show how he is just not going to be the guy. And my feeling right now is that of all the declared candidates, because that I still keep holding that Hillary card in my back pocket.
Yeah, you suspect she's going to rise from the grave, as you put it.
I think that there's it's going to be a sort of slouching from Chappaqua moment. But
isn't that strange that the political system has look? There's talks of Michelle Obama, and obviously you had the legacy candidates, not just in the Clintons, but you had the Bushes.
Yeah.
It's very strange that it almost becomes this kind of regal
it is
family
because,
heritage line.
Let's go back to from 1988. We had a Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and the idea that you could get a Clinton again, you could have power concentrated at the top in the hands of a few families is just bizarre. I mean, if we get one of the Obama girls starting to enter politics, well then this is exactly what the founders had wanted to avoid with the idea that there was a presidency, not a monarchy. I mean, you go back how George Washington refused anything that would even strike of a regal title, because that's exactly what they wanted to prevent, was the idea that there would be any sort of new royalty establishing itself in the United States. And so it is funny as you
and then they've just gone and done it anyway.
I mean, you get there in the end.
Thank you, George.
And it's almost. I mean, look, it's interesting for students of history and human nature to wonder if there's kind of like, almost like a historical mean that societies always wind up coming back to, and things like the American experiment are definitely sort of deviations from that mean.
Well, it's probably also indicative of hierarchies when they start to corrupt. So obviously it's important to have this kind of hierarchical structure. But if they get perverted and corrupt, then you're going to see these family names.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's like, so the Bushes were sort of the last, and it's interesting because the Bushes represent kind of the last dying dynasty gasps of the old WASP aristocracy. So that was...
Explain that for me.
Well, the WASPs, pardon me, we can edit those coughs out, I'm sure.
Nope.
Nope.
We're going up warts and all.
We're going out warts and all. All right. So anyway, we're talking about the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. We're talking about the preppies, the New England sort of, established old money families. That's what the Bushes were very much. But that old aristocracy had a very different attitude, I think, to the new sort of quote-unquote meritocracy. And, there was a sense still of an old school European obligation and noblesse oblige, and that, they were still very much loyal to America and so on. Now, I think, families like the Clintons and the Obamas and the whole sort of new money classes, the new meritocracy, and there's a sort of an interesting little sideline here, but I think what's interesting is that you wind up with a new and even more established aristocracy because of a couple of things. What happens is that, because it's a so-called meritocracy, what happens then is that that everybody who winds up achieving their way into this believes that they absolutely deserve to be at the top. Whereas
Yes.
I think that if you are part of an aristocratic family or an old money family, there's a sense of obligation because you know that you were just sort of born into this. And it also makes it very hard for people like that to change the system because, of course, what they want to do is protect what they've now got. So you've created almost a, and we've seen this throughout history. You look at medieval Florence with the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and you look at, different, contesting families in England during the Civil War, and Roundheads and Cavaliers, all of this. This is sort of a thing that's happened before in history. It's happening now again in the United States, and if you
there are Australian politicians that kind of mimic this, and
but in nowhere the same way.
Can I take you somewhere strange with this?
We've already gone. We've
we've
Florence
diverted far off
the English Civil War. So yeah,
but I'd be really curious to. This is a theory that I have about what's happening in Australia. Christina Keneally reminds me of Alexandria Cortez. So I think she's causing Labor a lot of problems with border policy and the stance that Labor has taken with this particular Tamil family, the refugees.
Yeah.
By taking this stance and saying, well, they're legally not refugees, but on the grounds of compassion, they must stay.
Yeah.
It's akin to this open border policy,
Absolutely,
which is plaguing the Democrats. And then so how is Labor going to be able to pivot and take on the Conservatives in 2022?
So I mean, Australians and Americans are basically at heart and essentially a center-right people. They're both. The political sort of mean there is median is just slightly to the right of center, particularly on borders. And everybody, I think, like for Labor in Australia, I think the idea that they would once again try and go near that sort of open borders idea, which was disastrous for them so many times.
The broader question as well is, okay, but there's 10,000 people, 15,000 people who share that circumstance who are declared not refugees, but they might have heartbreaking stories or ties to the community. Does Labor now want a quasi-open border system?
Well, I think
so that they need to explain that policy.
I think that certainly the left side of Labor, just as the left side of Democrats, and actually most Democrats, I think now, want to see open borders because there's a fundamental, suspicion of the nation state, I think, on the left side of politics.
Sure.
And pretty much, for the entire second half of the 20th century and through to the 21st, the sort of the dominant sort of ethic in the schools and in teaching and in historical studies was that nationalism, the nation, far from being a cohesive way to organize people politically, which had successfully balanced power in Europe since the Treaty of Westphalia, was in fact actually this was an evil idea that pitted people against one another, and you wind up with the horrors of the two world wars. And so therefore the only thing to do is subsume nations into transnational bodies, be they the European Union or the United Nations or whatever, and that was the way to prevent the horrors of war. Now, I mean, we've gone into this sort of, and that's globalism, and that's what the liberal left elite believes in globalism, because they also like that transnationality and they like that they can move their money around and
the problem is balancing that with the practicality of things like, look, we've got a really generous country. Well,
the real practicality, though, Jack, is that the only cohesive way to organize people at a large level is as a nation state. It's functional, it works, and it doesn't have to be racially based. It can be entirely based on an idea, as Australia is, as America is. And I would note that America and Australia are both ideas, both nations that are based on an idea.
The suggestion that you want to create a nation that has common values, the Constitution that we all live by.
But that will necessarily...
It's deemed to be xenophobic sometimes.
Yeah, of course, because the fact is that a nation state, like any club, is a club, and so by its definition, that is exclusionary. Now, if you're almost... If the new religion of left liberalism has as one of its top commandments this idea of inclusion and inclusivity, which sounds like a lovely word until you actually start to look at how it works.
Until you take it to its extremes.
Well, yeah. Well, look. It's it's good to be welcoming. It's good to have an immigration policy. It's good to be generous and all of that. But you need to have control. And what happens then is if ordinary people do not feel like the country has control over it, then they will go to further and further extremes to elect people who will control those borders, because that's just simply the way it works. But that's the question. That's the question now that the Democrats are dealing with, because the fact is, to bring it back to the U.S. race now,
on the Tanya, our producer, will kill us if we don't get back.
On the question of, and she's a great producer, by the way. Tanya, we love you. Anyway, you're very Trumpian there.
We're going back to the U.S.
We're going back to the U.S. Get your boarding pass. But the Democrats have this real problem now that what 10 years ago was a perfectly acceptable moderate position, which is that borders need to be enforced. People who enter the country illegally should be kicked out of the country because you need to, among other things, protect American workers, American jobs, the American economy, American civil society. Perfectly reasonable stuff. Barack Obama talked about this. Bill Clinton talked about this. If a Democratic presidential candidate ran on what Barack Obama or Bill Clinton said on this subject when they were president, and they were both very popular presidents indeed, they would be chased off the stage as alt-right, neo-Nazi fascists. And it shows just how far the left of the Democratic Party has come on it. And one last thing, Jack, the American people have not come with them on this journey. So this has opened up a huge gap, because in the whole idea that they have to say, oh, well, Trump's for a border wall, so we have to run as far away from that as possible. And so we have to say, not only, are we going to have looser and less restricted immigration, we're just going to say whatever, and you can come into the country illegally, and that's not a crime, and you can, once you get here, you can get free health care, because they have to go that far radically opposed to Trump. Now, normal people are going to look at that and say, well, that's insane, because the entire world is going to come here and, want their CAT scans and want their whatever fixed and this and that and the other thing. And, that's why you have borders.
And what's interesting about Joe Biden, particularly with, there was another mass shooting, and the conversations come up again, and the way that Joe Biden is dealing with this is he says, well, Trump is evil essentially for not doing anything about it. But let's rewind, because he was running the government for a long time, 2 terms with Obama. And they had the ability, they had the legislative branch, they could have drafted legislation, and he did nothing. He did nothing to address what he's talking about now.
This is I think.
So it's the hypocrisy. It's like, okay, well, Joe Biden's biggest problem is that he was running the country, and then all these
Joe
critiques.
Biden wasn't running the country. But he was having a nap.
He was part of the administration.
Yeah, but he was part of the administration.
He probably was a bit sleepy.
And he does absolutely trade.
This is why they're turning on him.
Trades on this whole idea that that he's like the heir to the Obama legacy, which is of course hilarious.
Yeah, you don't inherit it, mate.
Obama hasn't even endorsed him. And the other day...
Because he's not a good candidate.
He's a terrible candidate. And the other day, he couldn't even remember Barack Obama's name. So, so look, but it's interesting. I want to talk about gun violence because...
what is Beto saying about all this?
Beto, Robert Francis O'Rourke, Beto O'Rourke, the one-time darling who had, 15 minutes of, I guess you'd call it sort of not real fame, but kind of karaoke fame as, the front-running media darling. Can
I ask you something really specific with
Please.
this? He's proposing a John Howard-style buyback program,
right?
But it would not be optional. So the conservatives in America,
that's
he's saying he did a press conference. And
so let's actually, we've got a couple of grabs here. Yeah. Cool. So we've got, and here's the thing, Beto O'Rourke his new thing now is saying he's trading on these deaths from some mass shootings, and he is trying to go all profane and cool and F this and F that and this is F'd up.
Yeah, he swears a lot.
He swears a lot.
Weird.
He's sweary. He jumps on tables. He's a weird guy.
What's he polling at? 1%?
Oh, 2%. I think if that.
What an irrelevant.
But if he gets up to 3, he's had a 50% increase. So there you go. It's coming off a low base. But yeah, I think we've got a clip here of
let's play it.
that we can hear.
We're averaging about 300 mass shootings a year. No other country comes close. So, yes, this is fucked up. And if we don't call it out for what it is, if we're not able to speak clearly, if we're not able to act decisively, then we will continue to have this kind of bloodshed. That's exactly what we're going to do. Americans who own AR-15s, AK-47s, will have to sell them to the government. We're not going to allow them to stay on our streets, to show up in our communities.
There you go. He's gone
It,
down.
it is such a serious, and it is devastating that they're having so many mass
Okay,
shootings.
but hang on. So sorry.
Because I think this is an area where you and I maybe split. Because I think
I just think that
what John Howard did to a degree has worked in Australia, and this, even though it's deemed to be quite radical in America, it does have a lot of support for some kind of quasi buyback.
Sure. Look, but we need to.
What do you think?
But we need to look at really the facts on this. And I know it's a very difficult issue, and people get really, really emotional.
Sure.
And as I've said and written about before, Australians really just don't understand the situation in America and what makes it different. So, just simply on the idea of a Howard-style buyback. Well, number one, the idea of making
So why wouldn't that work?
Well,
for
because
someone like me, which is sympathetic to the idea.
Because there's almost as many firearms in the United States as there are men, women, and children. So that's the first thing. So
it's a cost.
Well, that's only the start. Australians have a pretty different relationship with the government than Americans do. It was never as gun saturated as the United States, and people here don't have that sort of libertarian rebellious streak. I mean, sometimes I wish they had it a bit more on some things, but that Americans do when it comes to just simply like the idea that we might need our guns because the government might go and oppress us one day. And I mean, look, I don't know how anybody could look at headlines from around the world and think that could ever happen. I think that's just a crazy idea. But anyway, but the other thing too, though, is that it's actually a mistake to focus on AR-15s or whatever, because those weapons and these mass shootings, while they make headlines, they are a minuscule proportion of the homicides in the United States. And on any given weekend in cities like Chicago and Baltimore, there will be dozens and dozens and dozens of shootings.
The problem I have with that argument...
So just one last thing then. So
let me jump in, though.
The idea, I'll absolutely jump in. The idea then, and most of those crimes are committed by people who are involved with other crime. And so...
Sure.
Where are you going to even go in these neighborhoods and say, "Hi, guys, you got to turn in your guns"?
Sure. The problem I have with that is I think you need to separate the data streams. So I don't think that because you have a massive problem with crime and deaths associated with gun-related violence, which is not this other category, it doesn't cancel it out, right? So you can do independent policy associated with different... So my thing is I think the issues are conflated. I think that the left does this, and I do think that conservatives also do this. I think it's mischievous on both sides.
Yep.
My thing is I think we need to have an honest discussion about this particular problem where there are mass shootings.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily buy the argument that, well, because there's more deaths happening in this particular part, it kind of trivializes this more insignificant number.
Look.
Because there's still people being gunned down.
Of course.
One's too many. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, no, I totally get all that.
And I'm with you on the majority of this.
I just think you just need to be really, really careful about talking about, either this idea that this is going to be, as low-hanging fruit as you think it is, but also I just think that, it sets very bad precedent to start talking about mandatory confiscations of anything.
Yep. But also, how's it going to work, mate? These guys aren't going to hand their guns over.
Of course not. So that's the thing. So you will get law-abiding people will turn in their guns, and it sounds like a cliche, but when the phrase always in the United States when I was growing up was, when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns, and there is, as much as that sounds trite, that also is true, because I remember growing up in New York City. Now, New York City has always had exceedingly strict gun control laws, and when I was young in New York City, gun crime was rampant, and, people were always getting guns stuck in their face, and so it was like, oh, wow, great, hey, we got all these laws against guns, why am I just been held up?
Well, we also have shootings every second weekend here in New South Wales, crime-related.
Yeah, on a far lower level.
There's quite a few. I've covered a fair few. We have a lot of shootings here, and big problem. We had a big problem with Middle Eastern crime gangs.
Yes.
They had to start an entire squad to clear it out.
I know, yeah.
So the notion that Australia fixed through the buybacks is incorrect.
Yeah. So you're coming around to my position.
No, I am. I'm fully on your. I'm just critiquing.
Yes.
I'm trying to poke some holes in it so we can have a very coherent picture. But
you know who actually does have an idea for all of this. And by the way, I will say though, unless you're going to talk about something that's quite sort of much broader, about mental health, about the culture,
Sure,
society.
sure.
You're never going to do this. I think that I actually genuinely think that there are a lot of real issues at almost a spiritual level in the United States that means that there are a lot of people who are far more disaffected and far more isolated and far more at risk of doing really awful things than there would be in a place with a more robust civil society. But, we can talk about that another time. But I do think that, the last many decades attacks on families and the church and things like that, and all of these mediating institutions have left a lot of people feeling isolated, atomized. Radical individualism is great if you're a success. It's not if you're not. And that leads to some people feeling very disaffected.
And it's not if these people bunch up at the bottom.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And that's kind of more a symptom of the corruption of that hierarchical process that we probably indicated before, where you've got top-heavy dynasty families recycling through, and then you've got cyclic societal poverty. And that's why the left does play an important role in, as someone who's a conservative, I do see the value that the left plays. That's the left's role. The problem is that
you mean they're not just there to be laughed at?
Well, unfortunately, the left working, the appropriate function of the left is that more sensible.
Well, I mean, what you're talking about here, I think, is
it's become radical activism.
You're talking about, the difference between, sort of,
I don't know what
reasonable
I'm talking
social
about.
democracy versus, radical leftism. And I think the problem is they've tilted far from honorable roots of trying to moderate the excesses of capitalism to let's have a revolution and tear down the whole system.
Unfortunately, anybody that says like I'm on the left, they are never that more reasonable. They're always combative.
Okay,
militant.
but I want to talk about now, Jack, my favorite leftist, and I got to say, I honestly think that if the Democrats don't nominate this woman, they're fools. Are you listening, Democrats? Nominate this woman. Marianne Williamson, I'm talking about, the New Age guru,
She is your
the
favorite.
self-help author, the Oprah guest, the woman who is,
Zali
America's answer to Zali Steggall, the woman who is basically like, every woman you've ever gotten to an argument over a spot in a car parking lot at a Whole Foods organic food shop in a big SUV.
What's going on with her?
This is her new thing. I love talking about her. She's great. She has written an op-ed this Labor Day weekend for the Washington Post. And she has talked about the culture of violence. She says, America doesn't just have a gun crisis, it has a culture crisis. Well, now, so insofar as that goes, that's kind of what we're saying. But where's she going to go with this? She's written, I propose a U.S. Department of Peace to coordinate and harness the powers of conflict resolution, restorative justice, violence prevention, trauma-informed education, mindfulness in the schools, child and family wraparound services. I'm not quite sure what that involves. Social and emotional learning, because, of course, kids are learning far too many facts already as it is in the schools. We need to have even less of that. And a world-class Peace Academy to train and deploy thousands of peace builders, plus national conferences, and a presidential task force for peace creation. We will make every effort to promote a culture of peace, both at home and abroad. We will address the root causes, not just the symptoms of violence in America, and in time we will transform our culture from one of conflict to one of peace.
James, I'm guessing you'd be familiar with George Orwell's Ministry of Love?
Yes.
And
this is sending us straight to Room 101.
The indoctrination reprogramming in 1984, that famous novel. This makes me, the Department of Peace reminds me
peace.
of the Ministry
Freedom is
of
slavery.
Love.
And, you just know there'll be a bunch of good 2-minute hates involved in all of that. So
it's like, and why would the Department of Peace, if you wanted to do this, why would they be involved in education to inform trauma-informed education and mindfulness in schools?
Well, I mean,
that's creepy.
It's of course it's creepy. So, you're going to have all these sort of, peacemongers, if I can use that phrase, out there everywhere, trying to ensure everybody, it's like you're turning they want to turn the entire nation into a progressive preschool. I just think it's just hilariously just awful, but it is also really kind of funny. And
well,
I just want to keep
it would be funny if this wasn't like a semi-important person with semi-legitimacy proposing as this.
Yeah. I mean,
this is like it's a radical.
Well, you know what it is.
indoctrination.
You know what it is. But it's not just about the radical indoctrination. It's also about, I think, the way the left always likes to see itself as the tolerant left. And Jack, though, as we know, the left is not always all that tolerant. And I got a great story for you.
They don't
here.
tolerate me very often.
Well, they don't. Yeah. Well, I think you're canceled, mate. Hashtag canceled. So there's a fundraiser coming up in a couple of weeks in Beverly Hills, of all places, for Trump. Now,
can I afford it? How much are the tickets?
It's a lot of money. It's I think you might need to bring some cash in an Aldi sack to that one there. The tickets are going to be anywhere from $1,000 to $100,000 per couple, which I think is probably
can't afford it
for the chance to go and dine on well done steaks with the president. But now here's the thing: the interesting thing is that the tolerant left, when I was growing up in America, one of the things that we were always talked about was McCarthyism and the blacklist and what a horrible stain that was on our history, that Hollywood, was prevented from having communists make films.
Explain McCarthyism for people, the guilt by association.
So Joe McCarthy was a guy, he was a senator in the United States in the 40s and 50s, who made his name on this platform of anti-communism and preaching that communists had infiltrated whole vast swathes of American society, and one of those was Hollywood. And so he started something that was called the Red Scare. Now, the funny thing about this is that he was one of those things where he was kind of wrong but kind of right. So, he tarred an awful lot of people unfairly, but he was actually right, and it later came out when you look at things like the Venona decrypts from the old Soviet Union, that in fact they had agents absolutely everywhere. But we were taught as a kid. So we were taught as a kid, though, that McCarthyism was terrible because, you were destroying people's lives because of their political beliefs and their political associations, which,
so how does that tie into what's happening
insofar as it goes. So we were taught that this was a great evil, and the left always said that this was a great evil, and Arthur Miller wrote a play about it called The Crucible, which is, set in Puritan New England, which is an allegory for all of this, which we all had to read. And, so it's about witch hunts and the idea that, is this all just a witch hunt? Well, McCarthyism is the new black. And so we've had Will and Grace. There's some show called Will and Grace. Have you heard of this, Jack?
Look, I don't mind Will and Grace. I think it's back. I don't think I'm going to watch it now after what these guys have been involved in.
Watch what you want, because I don't think you should. I think anybody should. I don't think anybody should be choosing their shows on their politics. However, why aren't you watching Sky News Australia? That's what I want to know.
Sorry, James, it's all I watch exclusively.
Good,
let me.
Yeah, good. So the Hollywood Reporter published a piece about this. Hollywood Reporter's local trade magazine. Deborah Messing of Will and Grace fame, is she Grace? She tweeted that she wanted a list of everyone planning on spending their Emmy week networking with the Trump administration, writing, quote, "Please print a list of all attendees, please. The public has a right to know." Her co-star, Eric McCormick, is that Will?
Yeah,
that's Will.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, the Hollywood Reporter, kindly report on everyone attending this event so the rest of us can be clear about who we don't want to work with. Thanks. So, hey, McCarthyism, it's cool. Hollywood is now all about saying your politics are wrong and we won't work with you and we're going to destroy your livelihood. So there we are.
If you attend a fundraiser for the Republicans,
we don't want to work with you. We don't want to work with you. Your name is mud. Your name is mud. You will never work again in this town, as they like to say.
Is it hypocritical for me to say I don't want to work with him?
I would actually pay good money to watch the two of you try and come up with a script together. I think, and because you could actually bring Jack all of your Will and Grace fan fiction that I know you've been working on.
I've watched a couple of episodes. I wouldn't say it's comedic genius, but I don't mind it. This is ridiculous, though. Let's break this down for what it is. People who cannot be in the same room with someone who they disagree with. How are you going to look? The thing I like about you is we disagreed a little bit briefly over the gun stuff.
Yeah.
And you just have a discussion.
Of course.
You move on.
Yeah.
You go to the pub, you have a beer.
Yeah.
How petulant a child
like 9
do you have to be to not want to work with someone who you disagree with about broader policy?
That's the thing.
It's insane.
This is the broader problem, is that, in the whole quest for diversity, they've ignored the fact that actually there's diversity of opinions, which is the most important thing, and entirely basing it on exogenous characteristics like, what your skin color is or what your sexuality is, and that everything flows from that. But yeah, it's just a small little nugget, but it is part
They're not
of this
obsessed with diversity. They're obsessed with conformity.
Conformity, correct. And it's part of this whole much bigger thing which we've seen in America and sadly in Australia, where suddenly it's like, if your politics aren't right, I won't do business with you. So, you see this whether it's a Chick-fil-A boycott or Israel Folau or anything like that.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah. But
lovely people.
Anyway, let's close out. You've got for us a fantastic wokest moment, and you're going to dress up for us.
Yeah, we've got a tweet. I don't know if we've got it up here on the screen, but I'll read it out anyway.
Rebecca Mackay. She's an author.
Is anyone else made really uncomfortable these days by anyone wearing any kind of red baseball cap? Like, I see one, like I see one, and my heart does weird shit, and then I finally realize it only says Titleist or whatever. Maybe don't wear red caps anymore, normal people.
Ah, you're wearing a red cap! Oh no, you're wearing the MAGA hat. The MAGA hat of death.
Look, Rebecca, I'm sorry that this makes you uncomfortable, but it's a reality that some people endorse reviews by this particular Republican candidate. If you find that uncomfortable.
It's also the fact that some people just don't.
You're welcome to shut your eyes.
Red ball caps. So, are people who are like Red Sox fans, Boston Red Sox fans, and they're not allowed to wear their red caps because you might trigger some author?
Is that how you're reading it? That any red...
Yeah, that's what she's saying. She's saying that look, if I see a red baseball cap,
she gets trauma from the color red.
From the color red, it is red rag.
God, I would have loved to have spent the 2016 election night with Rebecca. Just to see it. I would have, on the dinner table, I just would have flipped it on.
Are you sure she wasn't one of those people in one of those mashups of all the people who were crying and sobbing and everything?
What a ridiculous human being.
It's just a ridiculous
Let's move on.
thing
She doesn't deserve any more oxygen.
No, she doesn't. Anyway, I think that's it for what we've got this week here. We've had a fantastic Labor Day weekend special edition here, and we will be back next Wednesday for another episode of Race 2020. If this is your first time listening to us, thank you so much for listening, and do hit subscribe on the Apple or Android apps or whatever you're happening to be listening to this on.
We do appreciate it. Go to skynews.com.au/viewpoints and we'll send it directly to your inbox every Wednesday without fail. Thanks for listening. Cheers.